The note was 3 pages long, handwritten, 2.5 pages really, but long enough that whoever wrote it had to have been sitting at a table in the dark for a while, pressing pen to paper in someone else's house, with a child upstairs and Christmas lights still glowing through the windows outside. It started, "Mr. Ramsey, listen carefully, not dear Mr. Ramsey, not a salutation at all, really." Just his name and a command, like someone who had been rehearsing this and wanted it to land hard right from the first word. We are a group of individuals that represent a small foreign faction. A small foreign faction. The FBI, when they looked at this note later, said they had never in their experience seen a ransom note that used language like that. They had also never seen a ransom note that was written at the scene of the crime, on paper from the house, with a pen from the house, and left behind on a staircase inside the same building where the child's body would be found 7 hours later. The morning was December 26, 1996. Patsy Ramsey had come downstairs before 6 a.m. It was still dark. Her family had a flight to catch. They were going to Michigan for the continuation of the Christmas holiday, and there was packing still to do, and the morning was the kind of rushed, slightly scattered thing that mornings before early flights always are. She was moving through the house in the dark, making her way to the kitchen to start coffee when she turned onto the back staircase. The note was on the steps. She would later say she got through the first few lines and couldn't go any further. She ran up to her daughter's bedroom. The bed was made. JonBenét was gone. She called 911 at 5:52 in the morning. The dispatcher heard a woman's voice, shaking, rushing. "We have a kidnapping," Patsy said. "Hurry, please." She gave the address, 755 15th Street, Boulder, Colorado. Police arrived within minutes. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was 6 years old. She had blonde hair and blue-gray eyes, and she had won more child beauty titles than most grown women accumulate in a lifetime. She had gotten a bicycle for Christmas the day before. She had gone to bed in her white pants and red turtleneck, carried upstairs by her father because she had fallen asleep in the car on the way home from a Christmas dinner party at their neighbor's house. The note demanded $118,000. It warned John Ramsey not to contact the police. It said a small foreign faction was involved. It signed off with the letters SBTC, which have never been explained. Police would search that house for hours before anyone opened the latched door in the basement. Behind that door, in a small windowless storage room, wrapped in a white blanket with duct tape over her mouth and a cord around her neck, was JonBenét. She had been dead for hours. She was still wearing the white pants and red turtleneck her father had tucked her into bed in the night before, except now there was a new garment, long underwear, added at some point in the night by someone. On those long underwear, trace DNA from an unidentified male would be found, years later, by forensic investigators. That DNA has never been matched to anyone. The case has never been solved. For nearly 30 years, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey has been the open wound at the center of American true crime, a case that everyone has heard of and no one has explained. The ransom note with no ransom, the body that was never taken anywhere, the pineapple on the kitchen table, the grand jury that voted to indict the parents and the district attorney who refused to sign the papers. The detective who retired and came back and spent the rest of his life trying to find the intruder he believed was out there. The mother who fought ovarian cancer and raised her children in the middle of a media storm and never once saw an arrest and died before anyone was ever charged. The question that has followed this case from the first morning is simple. Who did this? It sounds like a question with an answer. Most murders have answers. Most homicides end eventually in a courtroom, in a verdict, in a name attached to a crime. This one has not. The police have a database of nearly 2,500 pieces of evidence. They have unidentified DNA. They have a ransom note with no kidnapper and a wine cellar with no intruder, and a family who have spent 3 decades insisting they did not hurt their daughter. What happened inside 755 15th Street, Boulder, Colorado, on the night of December 25, 1996? That is the question we are going to sit with tonight, not rush toward, not resolve before it's time. Just sit with, the way you sit with a question that is genuinely hard, slowly in the dark, with all the details laid out where you can see them. Start from the beginning. Boulder, Colorado sits at the base of the Rockies like something set down carefully on the edge of a map. It is not a big city. The Population in 1996 was roughly 93,000, a university town, an outdoor recreation culture, a particular strain of Colorado educated liberalism that made it feel distinct from Denver, which was 40 minutes east and in many ways a different world. Boulder had a well-ranked university and a Pearl Street pedestrian mall with good coffee shops and used bookstores and a busking scene on weekend afternoons. It had a cycling culture before cycling cultures were common in American cities. It had an outdoor gear store on almost every corner, and a culture of peak bagging, of triathlon training, of people who ran before work in the dark at altitude because they had chosen to live somewhere that made physical exertion the default. It attracted a certain kind of person. The scientist who worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research up on Table Mesa, the labs perched on the hillside above the city with a view of the whole Front Range. The professor at CU who had turned down jobs in warmer and more convenient places because Boulder was Boulder. The software engineer who had left California before California got crowded, who had found something here that California had not offered. The successful businessman who wanted fresh air and good schools and had enough money to have both. The mountains were not background. They were immediate. Sitting in Boulder looking west, the Flatirons rose up against the sky like something out of a painting that someone had failed to properly frame. Enormous tilted slabs of fountain formation sandstone, red-orange at noon and deep burgundy at sunset and gray in winter overcast, rising directly from the western edge of the city without preamble. They were a constant presence. People who lived in Boulder for years said they never stopped noticing them. The mountains were part of what made the city feel special to its residents. And that feeling of specialness was part of Boulder's identity. The sense that you had made a good choice, that you were somewhere better than most places, that the combination of intellectual culture and natural beauty and elevation was rare and worth protecting. In December, the Flatirons were capped with snow. The air at 5,430 feet above sea level was dry and cold and carried the smell of pine and winter. The sunsets came early, before 5 o'clock, and the light before them was the particular thin, golden, horizontal light of a mountain city in winter. Very clear, very cold, everything in sharp focus. University Hill, where the Ramseys lived, was one of the older residential neighborhoods in Boulder. It occupied a hillside west of the university campus, its streets running in a grid on the slope. 15th Street, 14th Street, 13th. The cross streets had names: Spruce, Pine, Arapahoe. The houses were substantial, stone and brick, many of them built in the early and mid-20th century, with mature trees in the yards and covered front porches and the kind of solidity that newer construction does not achieve. They were houses that had been added to over the decades, that had layers of renovation and history, that sat with a certain permanence in their lots. University Hill was a neighborhood for people who had arrived and settled, for families, for professors, for the professional class that Boulder had cultivated. People who walked their dogs in the evening and knew their neighbors' names. People who had strong opinions about the Pearl Street Food Co-op and the school board and the direction of the university. It had the texture of a neighborhood that functions as a community rather than just a collection of houses. 755 15th Street was a Tudor-style house, 6,866 square feet on a corner lot. John Ramsey had purchased it in 1991 for just under $500,000, a substantial sum in Boulder at the time, though not outside the range of what successful professionals were paying for significant homes in the neighborhood. The house had brick and stucco construction, steeply pitched gabled roof lines, a long driveway, mature trees on the corner. It had 5 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a formal dining room, a living room, with space enough for a substantial Christmas tree, and a basement with several rooms, utility space, storage, and one small windowless room sometimes called the wine cellar, accessible through a wooden door. John and Patsy Ramsey had moved into this house with their 2 children in 1991, and in 5 years they had made it their own. The Christmas tree was a large one. There were photographs on the walls, JonBenét's pageant photos and family pictures from Michigan and Georgia, the accumulation of 5 years of a family living together. The kitchen had the comfortable, slightly worn quality of a kitchen that has actually been used. Patsy cooked, Patsy baked. The kitchen was a room that was lived in. There were children's drawings somewhere, and school papers on the refrigerator, and the ordinary evidence of a family house. JonBenét Ramsey was 53 years old in December 1996. He had grown up in Lincoln, Nebraska, the son of a World War II pilot who had flown P-38s in the Pacific Theater. John had attended Michigan State University, earned a business degree, served in the U.S. Navy in the late 1960s, and then returned to Michigan State for an MBA. He started his career in technology sales and eventually founded what would become Access Graphics, a computer products wholesale company headquartered in Boulder that distributed technology hardware from manufacturers to businesses. Under his leadership, the company grew steadily over more than a decade. In 1996, Access Graphics exceeded $1 billion in annual sales, a milestone that had resulted in a substantial bonus for John, approximately $118,000. He was a tall man, composed in his manner, the kind of person who held his cards close and chose his words carefully. People who worked for him described him as fair and demanding in roughly equal measure, a businessman who set expectations and tracked results without theatrics. People who knew him personally described him as devoted to his family in a way that was quieter than Patsy's, more visible devotion but no less real. He coached Burke's baseball team. He showed up for JonBenét's pageants even when he might have been excused for treating them as Patsy's project. He was present. He had also known grief before any of this. His daughter Elizabeth, from his first marriage, was 22 years old when she was killed in a car crash in January 1992. John had buried a child. He knew what that was. Whether knowing that made what happened in December 1996 more bearable or less is not a question that can be answered from outside. Patricia Ann Paugh, who had been going by Patsy since childhood, was 40 years old in December 1996. She had grown up in Parkersburg, West Virginia, in a family that was firmly middle class. Her father was an engineer at Union Carbide, but in a community where women who were smart and attractive and driven could distinguish themselves through exactly the kinds of activities Patsy excelled at. She was vivid, funny, energetic. She had competed in pageants since she was a teenager. In 1977, she was crowned Miss West Virginia and went to Atlantic City for the Miss America competition, where she placed in the top 10. She had a degree in journalism from the University of Georgia, where she had met other ambitious women and absorbed the particular ethos of a Southern women's education in the late 1970s. Poise, presentation, the understanding that how you carry yourself matters, that self-presentation is a skill worth cultivating. She and John had married in 1980. They had moved to Boulder in 1991 when Access Graphics relocated there. She had built a social life in Boulder from scratch, joining St. John's Episcopal Church, becoming part of the professional community her husband's success made them part of, finding and keeping close friendships. She was the organizer, the planner, the person who remembered birthdays and orchestrated celebrations and made sure the events of a family's life were marked and remembered. In 1993, she was diagnosed with stage 5 ovarian cancer. This is worth pausing on because it changes everything about who Patsy Ramsey was in December 1996. Stage 5 ovarian cancer in 1993 carried a 5-year survival rate of approximately 20 to 30%. The median survival was measured in months, not years. What this meant, when the doctors told her, was that they were telling her she was probably going to die, maybe soon, probably before her children were grown. She refused to accept that. She underwent surgery. She underwent chemotherapy, the full course, the kind that makes you lose your hair and your appetite and sometimes your sense of who you are before the illness. She underwent a bone marrow transplant, which is one of the more difficult medical procedures a person can endure. The body's own blood cell production is destroyed and then rebuilt from scratch, and the window between destruction and recovery is one during which any infection can be lethal. She did all of this. She went to the National Institutes of Health. She fought. By 1994, she had been declared cancer-free. She was in remission. By December 1996, she had been in remission for approximately 2 years. The cancer had not returned. She had no reason to believe it would. She had emerged from the hardest 2 years of her life into something that felt, by her own account, like a gift, like time she had not been promised but had gotten anyway. People who survive serious illness and recover sometimes describe the period after as a kind of sharpening. The things that seemed the community JonBenét grew up in, was not simply wealthy in the abstract. It was wealthy in a specific Boulder way. professional, educated, outdoors-oriented, the kind of place where people talked about the environment and their children's schools with equal passion, where the social currency was intelligence and health, and the appearance of having made conscious choices about how to live. The Ramseys fit into this world comfortably. John's business success gave them the financial resources to live in University Hill and to send their children to good schools and to be part of the philanthropic and church community that characterized the social upper stratum of the city. Patsy's warmth and organizational energy made her a natural connector. People liked her, and people who liked her tended to tell other people to call her. JonBenét's school, High Peaks Elementary, was a good public school in the southern part of the city, known for its engaged parent community and its strong teachers. Her kindergarten class was small. Her teacher was the kind of person who remembered specific children years later, which is itself a measure of JonBenét's distinctiveness. She was a child who made an impression. The pageants happened on weekends mostly, at venues around Colorado and occasionally out of state. They were a separate world from kindergarten and soccer, and the neighborhood on 15th Street, their own culture with their own hierarchies, their own judges and coaches and families who traveled the circuit together. For JonBenét, the two worlds did not seem to conflict. She was equally comfortable in both of them. This was Boulder in December 1996, a prosperous university town at the base of the mountains in the run-up to Christmas, with children who had school concerts and holiday parties and were counting down the days. The Ramsey house was lit up for the season. The bicycle was wrapped and waiting. None of what happened next was written into the landscape. The mountains did not signal it. The neighborhood did not suggest it. The city was exactly what it always was, a place where people had chosen to be, carefully, for reasons that had to do with beauty and community and the quality of the air and the proximity to the Flatirons. And then December 26th came, and it became something else permanently. To understand what happened in that house, you have to know the people in it. Not as they were portrayed in the tabloids in 1997, which reduced them to caricatures almost immediately. The cold businessman, the stage mother, the too perfect child. Not as they appeared in the years of legal maneuvering and public statements and defamation suits that followed. You have to know them as the specific people they were in December 1996, living a specific life in a specific city before any of it happened. John Ramsey. JonBenét Ramsey was, by all accounts from people who knew him personally, a quiet and methodical man. He was not given to displays of emotion. He planned things. He thought before he spoke. His business success had come from the kind of sustained, patient work that does not generate dramatic stories, steady growth, careful management, the long building of something that compounds over years. Access Graphics did not make headlines until the investigation into his daughter's death made it newsworthy. Until then, it was a successful wholesale operation that not many people outside the technology industry had heard of. He was a man who had already survived grief. The death of his daughter Elizabeth in 1992, 4 years before JonBenét was killed, had broken something in him that he rebuilt but perhaps never fully repaired. People who knew him described him as devoted to his children in a way that was quieter than Patsy's devotion, but no less real. He coached Burke's baseball team. He attended JonBenét's pageants. He carried his daughter to bed when she fell asleep in the car. He was not, by the accounts of friends and business associates, a frightening man. He was not a man people described in terms of a temper or unpredictability. He was, in the word that kept coming up from people who knew him, steady. In the weeks and months after JonBenét's death, he would demonstrate a characteristic that investigators and the public found frustrating. He did not cooperate quickly. He and Patsy, on the advice of their attorneys, did not submit to formal police interviews until April 30th, 1997, 4 months after their daughter's body was found. They hired top legal counsel immediately. They did not speak publicly beyond carefully managed appearances. This restraint, which from their perspective was sensible self-protection in a situation where they were already being treated as suspects, read to the public and to the Boulder Police Department as evidence of guilt. Whether that restraint was strategic or simply traumatized or some combination is not possible to determine from outside. What can be said is that John Ramsey maintained, without wavering for nearly 30 years, that he did not kill his daughter and that no one in his family did. Patsy Ramsey Patsy was harder to summarize because she was more vivid, more outward-facing, more immediately present in any room she entered. People who loved her described her as warm and funny, creative and driven, a woman who organized things and made them happen. People who did not love her sometimes described the same qualities as overbearing, as pushy, as the kind of energy that could become pressure. The pageant mother characterization was the one that stuck in the media, and it was not entirely unfair. Patsy had been a pageant woman herself, and she genuinely believed in it as a vehicle for her daughter's development. Poise, confidence, performance, the ability to stand in front of a crowd and be present. The critics saw the makeup, the glitter, the big hair on a 6-year-old, and concluded that something about Patsy's relationship with her daughter was more about Patsy than about JonBenét. The reality was almost certainly more complicated. JonBenét appeared from accounts of people who watched her compete to enjoy performing. She lit up in front of a crowd. She would not have been the first child to be good at something her parent pushed her toward and to take ownership of it in her own way. What she would have been like at 15 or 25, whether she would have continued competing, whether she would have turned away from it entirely, whether she would have been grateful or resentful for how her mother had raised her, is one of the many questions that the night of December 25 made unanswerable. What is known about Patsy in December 1996 is that she was alive in a way she had not expected to be. 2 years earlier, doctors had told her she had stage 4 ovarian cancer, and stage 4 of that disease, then as now, carried a very low survival rate. She had undergone everything that was available: surgery, aggressive chemotherapy, a bone marrow transplant that put her body through experiences most people cannot imagine. She had survived. She had come back to her family and to her life and to her children, and she was not going to take any of it for granted. People who knew her in 1996 said she was fully present. She was involved in her children's lives at a level that might have seemed like overinvestment to outsiders, but made sense given what she had been through. She had almost missed all of it. She was not going to miss anything she didn't have to. The cancer had been in remission for approximately 2 years. She had no reason to believe, on December 25, 1996, that it would come back. It did. She was re-diagnosed in 2003, but she did not know that yet. On Christmas night, she was Patsy Ramsey, who had beaten the odds, who had her family around her, who was going on a holiday trip to Michigan the next morning. She would be dead in 10 years. She would never know who killed her daughter. JonBenét Ramsey was, by every account from anyone who knew her, a child who was hard not to like. She was small, 3 feet 11 inches, 45 pounds. She had blonde hair that curled at the ends and blue-gray eyes and the kind of smile that photographs well, the kind that doesn't look like a performance even when it is. She had an ease with adults that was unusual in a 6-year-old, not precocious in the irritating sense, but genuinely comfortable, a child who could talk to a stranger and not seem strange for doing it. At High Peaks Elementary, her teacher remembered her as enthusiastic, quick to participate, the kind of student who made a classroom feel more alive. She had friends. She was good at sports for her age. She had, in the way of some children who have been in the spotlight from an early age, a certain self-possession, a sense of being comfortable in her own skin. The pageant world had given her a stage presence that was hard to miss. Footage of her competing footage that would be played over and over on television news after her death, sometimes with commentary that ranged from admiring to horrified, shows a child who genuinely knew how to perform. She worked the stage. She made eye contact with the judges. She held the smile through the whole routine. You could argue about the context, about whether it was appropriate, about what it meant that a 6-year-old had been taught to do those things, but you could not argue that she looked unhappy doing it. She looked like she was having fun. On December 25, 1996, JonBenét Ramsey got a bicycle for Christmas. She wore white pants and a red turtleneck to the Whites' dinner party that evening. She played with the other children. She was, by all accounts from the people who were there, normal and happy and fully herself. Someone who was at the party that night remembered her singing Christmas carols. Someone else remembered her curled up in a chair, full from dinner, getting tired. She fell asleep in the car on the way home. Her father carried her upstairs and put her to bed, still dressed. Her mother came in and covered her and said goodnight. Her brother was still awake in the house somewhere. She was 6 years old. That is the last verified picture of her alive. Burke Ramsey Burke is the family member the public knows least about and the one who has been treated most unfairly. He was 9 years old on the night his sister was killed. He was interviewed by investigators at least 3 times in the weeks and months after her death. A child psychologist who reviewed those interviews and the family dynamics found nothing concerning. The report described the Ramseys as having healthy, caring family relationships. Boulder Police and the District Attorney's Office both stated clearly and repeatedly that Burke was not a suspect. The DA's office reiterated in May 1999 that he had never been considered a suspect. He grew up in the middle of the most public murder investigation in American history, with his parents' names on tabloid covers and television screens, with strangers forming opinions about what happened in his house, with the loss of his 6-year-old sister never quite settling into something manageable because it was never quiet enough to grieve. He moved with his family to Atlanta 6 months after JonBenét's death. He grew up and went quiet, which was the only reasonable response to his situation. In 2016, CBS aired a documentary that used expert analysis to theorize that Burke had struck his sister with a flashlight after she took pineapple from his bowl, and that the staged kidnapping scenario was a cover-up orchestrated by Patsy. Burke filed a $750 million defamation lawsuit. The case was settled in January 2019, with terms undisclosed. His lawyer stated it was resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. What Burke knows about that night, if he knows anything beyond what is in the public record, has never been established. He was a 9-year-old child. He has never been charged with anything. He did not do press after the settlement. He has lived, by every indication, as privately as a person can live, when their sister's name is known everywhere. Fleet and Priscilla White Fleet White was John Ramsey's close friend, the man who hosted the Christmas dinner party on December 25, who was with John Ramsey when John found JonBenét's body in the basement. In the years after the murder, Fleet White became a vocal and increasingly frustrated critic of the investigation, believing that Boulder police had mishandled the case from the first hours and that critical evidence had been lost or mismanaged. He gave interviews. He wrote letters to officials. He was someone who had been in the house on the morning of December 26, who had walked those rooms before they were a crime scene in any real sense, and who had seen what he saw. His presence in the story is a reminder that the people most affected by a crime are not always just the immediate family. The Whites had celebrated Christmas with the Ramseys every year. They had eaten dinner with JonBenét the night she was killed. The next morning, they were standing in the living room while police moved through the house, and a forensics team cordoned off one bedroom, and friends and ministers arrived at the door, and the whole morning unraveled into something no one was prepared for. Lou Smit. Lou Smit came into the JonBenét Ramsey investigation in early 1997, when the Boulder County District Attorney's Office recruited him to bring fresh eyes to a case that was already becoming complicated. He was in his late 50s. He had spent decades as a homicide detective in Colorado Springs and had compiled what was, by any measure, an extraordinary career. Every homicide case he had investigated, he had solved. Every one. He was a compact man, white-haired, soft-spoken, deeply religious. He was also the most experienced homicide investigator to touch the Ramsey case by a significant margin. He approached it the way he approached every case, by looking at what the evidence actually said, not what anyone had already decided it meant. What the evidence said to Lou Smit was that the Ramseys had not killed their daughter. He reached this conclusion after months of careful analysis, and it put him in direct conflict with the Boulder Police Department, who had been building their case against John and Patsy Ramsey since the morning of December 26th. He resigned from the case in September 1998, rather than be part of an investigation he believed had gone in the wrong direction. He spent the remaining 12 years of his life working the case privately, gathering evidence, pursuing leads, trying to identify the intruder he was convinced had entered 755 15th Street on Christmas night and never been caught. He died in 2010 without an answer. The case died with him still open. Steve Thomas. If Lou Smit was the detective who believed the Ramseys were innocent, Steve Thomas was the detective who believed with equal conviction that Patsy Ramsey was guilty. He was a Boulder detective who worked the case intensively in the year after the murder. He developed a detailed theory that Patsy had struck JonBenét in a fit of rage, possibly after a bedwetting episode, and had then staged the kidnapping to cover it up. Thomas resigned from the Boulder Police Department in 1998. citing what he described as interference from the district attorney's office, which he believed had worked to protect the Ramseys rather than prosecute them. He wrote a book about the case, JonBenét, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, and was sued for defamation by the Ramseys' legal team. That suit was settled out of court. Thomas and Smith. Two experienced investigators, one case, two completely opposite conclusions. That is not unusual in a complicated investigation. What was unusual was that both men cared enough to resign rather than compromise their belief, and that both spent years after leaving the case continuing to work it on their own terms. No one has been charged, no one has been convicted. Both detectives are gone now, and the question they spent years arguing about is still open. There is one more person worth dwelling on in the portrait of those involved, and that is the detective who never officially solved the case but never stopped trying. Lou Smith died on August 11, 2010. He was 73 years old. His family was with him. He had spent the last 12 years of his life working the JonBenét Ramsey case outside any official capacity, reviewing evidence on his own time, sharing his conclusions with journalists and investigators who would listen, corresponding with people who had information to offer. He did not let it go. His audio diaries, which became part of the Netflix documentary, reveal a man who thought about the case every day, who turned the evidence over in his mind with a patience and precision that his family described as his mode in every investigation he had ever worked. He was not haunted by the case in the dramatic sense, he was engaged by it. He believed the evidence showed something specific and true, and he could not understand why other investigators could not see it the same way. He is gone. Steve Thomas, who believed the opposite with equal conviction, is still living as of this writing. The two of them represent the central tension of the case as well as any single piece of evidence. Two people who looked at the same thing and saw completely different pictures. That is the JonBenét Ramsey case. Finally, two pictures, 30 years, no resolution. And a 6-year-old girl whose name has been said more times than she ever heard it spoken in her own life, because the world that failed to answer the question of her death kept returning to her, kept saying her name, kept trying to find a way to give her something that the investigation has not been able to give her yet. An answer. It is still coming, maybe, or it is not. The question remains. The last day of JonBenét Ramsey's life was December 25th, 1996. Christmas Day, the morning began, the way Christmas mornings do in houses with children. Burke and JonBenét were up early, or they woke their parents early. The specific time has never been precisely pinned down, but it was early enough that the sky was still the particular dark gray of a Colorado winter before sunrise, the kind of morning where the stars are still visible through the windows if you look west toward the Flatirons. JonBenét got the bicycle she had wanted. She was thrilled with it. Photographs from that morning show her grinning, flushed with the specific joy of a child who got the exact thing she wanted most. That open-mouthed, eyes-crinkled delight that is not performed and cannot be faked. The bicycle was a good one. Pink, if the recollections are accurate, with a white seat and streamers at the handlebars. There was fresh snow on the ground outside, so she could not ride it yet. But she could stand next to it and hold the handlebars and feel the weight of it and know that it was hers. Burke opened his gifts. There were other presents for both children. Games, books, clothing, the usual accumulation of a generous Christmas in an affluent household. John and Patsy were present, watching, fully there in the way that parents try to be on Christmas morning, which requires setting down everything else and attending only to the children. The day was cold. Boulder in December is reliably cold. The mountains behind the city already deep in their winter. The air at altitude thinner and drier and colder than people from lower elevations expect. The ground held snow from earlier in the week. The sky Christmas Day was clear or partly cloudy. The specific weather records do not give a precise account, but the broad picture is of a bright, cold Colorado winter day, the kind that feels festive when there are children in the house. The Ramseys' plans for the day included a Christmas dinner that evening at the home of Fleet and Priscilla White. Fleet White was one of John Ramsey's closest friends in Boulder, a big, direct man. Someone who said what he thought and was reliable in the way that people who have lived alongside you for years become reliable. He and Priscilla had known the Ramseys since the family moved to Boulder in 1991. Their children were friends with Burke and JonBenét. Christmas dinner at the Whites was a tradition that the two families had established over those 5 years, and in 1996 there was no reason to think it would be anything other than what it always was: warm and crowded and full of the particular noise of multiple children in a house together. After dinner, the Ramseys had an early flight the next morning, December 26, to Charlevoix, Michigan, where John owned a vacation home. This was the next leg of the holiday: Christmas with the Whites, then on to Michigan to see the wider family. JonBenét's new bicycle was going to come on the trip. Everything was arranged, everything was set. At some point during the day, JonBenét put on her Christmas clothes. The outfit she wore to the Whites was white velvet pants. Soft, fitted, the kind of thing a pageant mother chooses for a daughter going to a Christmas dinner because it photographs beautifully and is obviously festive. She wore a white and red turtleneck sweater over them. Her hair was done. She was 6 years old and dressed like Christmas. The underwear she was wearing that day was printed with small black Star of David designs on a white background, an item that would later be noted in the investigation because it was among the clothing documented on her body. There has been speculation about whether this specific pair of underwear was significant in some way. The most straightforward interpretation is that it was simply what she was wearing, what she had put on that morning, and the pattern had no meaning beyond being an item. A 6-year-old picked out of a drawer. The Ramseys arrived at the Whites' house sometime between 4:30 and 5:00 in the afternoon. The Whites lived close enough that the families could practically see each other's rooftops on that hillside neighborhood. Other guests were present, the Fernie family, and possibly others in the circle of Boulder professional families that the Ramseys moved within. It was a full house. JonBenét played with the other children. She was energetic, happy, entirely herself, the social one, the one who moved through a group easily and drew other children into whatever she was doing, the one who adults noticed because she was comfortable talking to anyone. She was not performing, or not only performing, she was just JonBenét, who happened to be good at being in a room. After dinner, at some point in the late evening, neighbors came by and the group went Christmas caroling. Fleet White went out with the children. JonBenét caroled, she sang. This is one of the last images that anyone outside the immediate family would carry of her, a small girl with her head back, singing on a cold Christmas evening on a snow-covered street in Boulder, her breath visible in the cold air. The Ramseys left the Whites' house sometime around 9:30 or 10 p.m. John would later say JonBenét had fallen asleep in the car before they reached home. It was a short drive, minutes, really. He carried her inside, up the stairs to her bedroom, and put her in her bed still dressed. He did not change her into pajamas. He laid her down and covered her. Patsy came in, tucked the blanket around her, and kissed her goodnight. Burke was still awake. He was 9 years old and not yet tired, and what exactly he was doing in the house at that hour has never been established with precision. The living room, the kitchen, his own room, the record does not pin him to a specific location at a specific time. John and Patsy wound down, the house settled. The Christmas tree lights may have still been on. That detail has never been confirmed either way. The lights along the roofline outside were on. The street was quiet. What happened after the family retired to bed is the central question of this case. Sometime after the family went to sleep, JonBenét ate pineapple. This is established by the autopsy. The medical examiner found fragments of what appeared to be pineapple, described in the report as a yellow to light green-tan apparent vegetable or fruit material, in her stomach and small intestine in a state of partial digestion, consistent with having been consumed approximately 1 to 2 hours before her death. The autopsy estimated the time of death somewhere between 10 p.m. on December 25th and 6 a.m. On December 26th, with the middle of that range, midnight to 2 a.m. considered most probable based on the level of food digestion and other markers. This means JonBenét ate pineapple somewhere between 10 p.m. and roughly 1 a.m. The pineapple mattered because of what was found on the kitchen table. When Boulder police officers arrived at the Ramsey home in the first minutes of December 26th, photographs were taken of the house. One of those photographs, taken before anyone in the house had a chance to move anything, showed a bowl of fresh pineapple on the kitchen table. Not a small bowl, a bowl with what appeared to be a reasonable quantity of pineapple sitting on the table with a spoon in it, uncovered, as though it had been used recently and then left rather than put away. Police found Patsy Ramsey's fingerprints on the bowl. Police also found Burke Ramsey's fingerprints on the bowl. Neither John nor Patsy said they remembered putting pineapple on the table that night. Neither of them said they remembered feeding JonBenét pineapple after the party. Patsy said she had not given her any. The bowl was there. The pineapple was in JonBenét's stomach. There are benign explanations. Fingerprints on a bowl in a family kitchen accumulate over days and weeks. Patsy might have used that bowl on December 24th, or used it to serve something else on December 25th, and her prints remained on it from earlier. Burke might have gotten himself a snack of pineapple and left the bowl on the table, and JonBenét might have come downstairs and eaten some of his, or gotten her own. The possibility that JonBenét herself came downstairs, found the pineapple, and ate some without waking anyone is entirely plausible in a house where a 6-year-old has had an exciting Christmas and might be hungry. But none of these scenarios, including the most innocent ones, explains why no one in the house remembered it happening or acknowledged setting out the bowl. The pineapple stays with you because it is the most concrete indicator that something occurred in that kitchen after the family was supposed to be in bed, and whatever it was, no one has fully accounted for it. A neighbor named Scott Gibbons reported that sometime around midnight on December 25 to 26, he looked out his kitchen window and noticed that the upper kitchen lights in the Ramsey home were on, dimmed but on. His house was positioned to have a sight line into that area of the Ramsey home. Another neighbor, Melody Stanton, reported that she awoke in the early hours of December 26 to the sound of what she described as a child's scream coming from the direction of the Ramsey residence. She put the time at some time after midnight. She did not investigate, did not call police, went back to sleep, and only later came forward with this account. Both of these accounts are consistent with the timeline the physical evidence suggests, that something happened in the Ramsey house between midnight and 2 a.m. Neither account is definitive. Stanton heard something she characterized as a child's scream. She did not see anything. She did not verify the direction, and human memory of sounds in the night hours is not always reliable. Gibbons saw lights. Lights in a kitchen at midnight could mean many things. But together, the neighbor accounts and the pineapple and the autopsy's digestion timeline all point to the same window. Something was happening in that house with JonBenét awake around midnight. What happened is the question. The mechanism of her death was determined by the autopsy performed by Boulder County Coroner John Meyer on December 27, 1996. The official cause of death was asphyxia by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. Both injuries were severe. Either one, independently, could have been lethal. The skull fracture was devastating. The crack extended 8.5 inches across JonBenét's skull, from the right side of the back of her head, sweeping across the top toward the front. It was a linear fracture with a branching pattern, the kind that results from a single high-force impact rather than from multiple blows or from a fall. The bone had not collapsed inward. The fracture was not depressed, but the force involved was substantial. Beneath the fracture, the medical examiner found a 1.5 centimeter area of subdural hemorrhage, a pocket of blood pooling between the surface of the brain and the skull above it. The medical examiner's assessment was that this blow could have rendered JonBenét unconscious almost immediately. A blow that size from a blunt object on the skull of a 6-year-old child. The object that caused it was never definitively identified. A large black metal Maglite flashlight was found on the Ramsey's kitchen counter on the morning of December 26th. It was clean, no blood, no hair, no biological material on its surface. Whether it had been wiped or whether it was not the object is unknown. The flashlight was large enough to cause the injury documented. It belonged to the household. No other object in the house was identified as the weapon. The garrote told its own story. It was made from two materials, a length of white nylon cord and the broken handle of a paintbrush. The paintbrush had belonged to Patsy Ramsey. It was from a tray of art supplies she kept in a storage room in the basement, a room that connected to the corridor near the wine cellar where JonBenét's body was found. The paintbrush handle had been broken, and the lower third of it, the piece used in the garrote, was wrapped with the nylon cord and used as a handle to tighten the strangulation. The bristle end of the brush remained in the tray. The broken lower portion was never found. The nylon cord was white. It was approximately 45 inches long based on what was wound around JonBenét's neck. The source of the cord was never identified. It did not match any item found in the Ramsey household. and there was no record of where it had come from or when it had entered the house. The garrote had been tightened by twisting the stick handle, like a tourniquet, like a Spanish garroting mechanism, the technique that gives the device its name. The nylon cord had been drawn deep into the soft tissue of JonBenét's neck, leaving a ligature mark that the medical examiner described as a deep furrow circling entirely around. The level of force required to tighten a garrote to that degree is not trivial. This was a sustained, deliberate act. JonBenét's wrists had also been bound, white cord, looped and tied loosely above her head in what the medical examiner noted were ligatures not tight enough to have meaningfully restricted circulation. The binding was present but not functionally severe. Lou Smit would later make an argument about this, that the loose binding was more consistent with an intruder staging a crime scene, mimicking the appearance of bondage in a kidnapping, than with a parent who would have known there was no practical need to bind a 6-year-old. Smith's opponents made the opposite argument, that loose binding was evidence of staging by someone who was creating a scene to be found later, not by someone who actually needed to restrain the child. Both arguments are internally coherent. Neither is proven. Duct tape covered JonBenét's mouth when her father found her. A single piece. When the medical examiner examined the tape residue on her skin, there was also evidence suggesting the tape had been removed and reapplied at some point. There was adhesive residue in areas where the tape found in place did not entirely align. What this means is disputed. It could indicate removal and replacement during or after the assault, or it could reflect normal variation in how adhesive behaves on human skin. The tape itself was not identified as belonging to any specific source within the Ramsey home. JonBenét's body was found in a specific position. She was lying on the floor of the wine cellar, covered with the white blanket. Her arms were extended above her head. There was a piece of brown paper, a paper sack, the kind used for groceries or storage, beneath her. The blanket was wrapped around her body and face. The wine cellar was a small, windowless room accessed through a wooden door in the basement corridor. The door had a wooden latch at the top of the door frame, a simple mechanism, a bar that dropped into a notch, the kind of latch designed to keep the door closed from the inside. When Officer Rick French had come to that door, during the initial search at 6 a.m., the latch was in its closed position. He had walked past. The latched door has been one of the persistent points of argument in this case. Smit and the intruder theorists argued that a person inside the room could have latched it from the inside as they exited through another means, or that the latch had been closed after the fact by someone else. Critics argued that a latched from the inside door in a basement was not evidence of a kidnapper and was far more consistent with someone inside the house having secured the room. There is no resolution to this argument available in the public record. What is certain is that, when John Ramsey opened that door at 1 p.m. on December 26th, 7 hours after Patsy's 911 call, 7 hours after Officer French had walked past it, his daughter was inside. She was dressed in the white pants and red turtleneck she had worn to the Whites' Christmas party. She was also wearing long underwear, long white thermal long johns that had not been part of her outfit when she went to bed. John Ramsey said he had not dressed her in them. Patsy said she had not. The long underwear was identified as belonging to the Ramsey household. It was the correct size for JonBenét, consistent with her wardrobe, who had put it on her, and when is unknown. On those long johns, forensic investigators would eventually find trace DNA from an unidentified male. In December 2003, 7 years after the murder, forensic investigators finally extracted enough material from a mixed blood stain on JonBenét's underwear to establish a DNA profile. The profile belonged to an unknown male. It did not match John Ramsey, it did not match Burke Ramsey, it did not match any family member. It was submitted to the FBI's CODIS database, which at the time contained over 1.6 million profiles. No match was returned. In 2008, touch DNA analysis, which recovers genetic material deposited by skin cells through handling, rather than from blood or other biological fluids, was applied to the long underwear. The male DNA found there matched the profile from the underwear, same unknown male. 2 separate garments, 2 separate sample types. Same genetic signature. Neither sample has ever been matched to a known individual. The sexual assault evidence in the autopsy report requires care in how it is described. The medical examiner found no evidence of conventional rape and no semen. There was evidence, however, in the formal language of the autopsy, evidence of vaginal trauma, an injury that the medical examiner considered inconsistent with normal or accidental causation. The vaginal area had been wiped. The medical examiner noted as though someone had cleaned it, possibly with the white blanket that now served as her shroud, possibly with something else. There was evidence suggesting the same paintbrush handle that had been incorporated into the garrote may have been used as an instrument of sexual assault. The sequence of events, what happened in what order, which injury came first, how long each phase of the assault lasted is not definitively established in the public record. What the medical examiner concluded was that both the skull fracture and the strangulation were severe enough to cause death. The strangulation followed or coincided with the blow to the head. A person who was unconscious from a skull fracture would not struggle against being strangled. If she was unconscious when the garrote was tightened, she would not have known. That is one of the small mercies available in this case. It is a very small one. Now the ransom note, in more detail than it usually receives. The note was written on a yellow legal pad. The pad was found in the Ramseys' kitchen, in a drawer or on a counter, depending on which account you read, but in the kitchen, accessible. The pen used was also from the house. Both of these items were confirmed by manufacturers to match items found in the Ramsey home. The note ran to 374 words. For reference, the average American adult reads at roughly 200 to 300 words per minute, which means the note took 1 to 2 minutes to read. Writing it at the pace of someone composing and committing to paper would have taken substantially longer, perhaps 10 to 15 minutes, perhaps more if the author paused to think or revised as they went. The practice note suggests they did pause and revise. 10 to 15 minutes, sitting at a table in someone else's kitchen, in a house where a family was asleep upstairs, writing a ransom note while a child lay dead in the basement below. If you accept the intruder theory, the intruder sat in that kitchen and wrote for 15 minutes and then left. This would require nerves of a specific and unusual kind. Lou Smith argued that this was precisely the profile of a practiced, organized predator, someone who had planned this in advance, who had written a draft at home or in another location, who was executing a plan rather than improvising. The note's echoes of film dialogue on this reading are fragments from a mental library the author had assembled long before he set foot in the house. If you accept the family theory, the note was written by someone who knew the house intimately and who was buying time, constructing an explanation for why a child was missing from her bedroom, a story to tell when morning came and the body was found, a staging intended to redirect the investigation toward a fictional kidnapping and away from the truth. Both scenarios are internally possible, neither has been proven. The $118,000 figure remains one of the most specific and strange elements of the note. It is not a round number. It does not correspond to any standard ransom amount. It corresponds exactly to the bonus John Ramsey had received, a private financial transaction, not in any public record. The investigators who focused on the Ramseys interpreted this as the strongest evidence that someone inside the family wrote the note. Only someone with access to John's financial information would have known the bonus amount, but the bonus amount might not have been as private as it seemed. John was the president of a company. His bonus would have appeared in company financial records. Anyone with access to Access Graphics' internal accounting, employees, contractors, auditors, anyone who had done work that brought them into contact with compensation data might have known or been able to find out what John Ramsey's bonus was that year. The company had dozens of employees. The list of people who might have had access to that information without being family members is not as short as it first appears. This is characteristic of the JonBenét Ramsey case more broadly. The evidence that seems most conclusive tends to dissolve on close examination into a set of possibilities rather than a single answer. The note signed off with SBTC and Victory. SBTC has prompted 30 years of speculation. Saved by the Cross, a religious reference consistent with someone who identified as Christian, which would fit either the Ramseys, who attended St. John's Episcopal, or any number of other people. Small business technology company, which has been suggested but which makes no contextual sense in a ransom note. Subic Bay Training Center, a military reference. None of these interpretations has been established as correct. The letters remain unexplained. Victory, as a sign-off to a ransom note, is also unusual. Triumphant, almost exultant, the word of someone who felt they had won something. An intruder celebrating a successful plan. A person in crisis staging a scene and overwriting it with emotion. The forensic linguists who analyzed the note noted this word as one of several elements that felt emotionally incongruous with the stated purpose of the note, which was supposed to be a business-like demand for money. The note also contained a number of spelling and grammatical errors, bussiness for business, possession for possession, hence a earlier instead of hence an earlier. These errors were analyzed extensively. Some investigators believed they were deliberate, an attempt to disguise the author's educational level or writing style. Others believed they were genuine errors, consistent with someone writing quickly under stress. The CBI analysis noted that some spelling patterns were consistent with Patsy Ramsey's known writing. The federal court found the opposite. There is also a line in the note that has received less attention than the dollar amount. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be difficult. This line addressed John Ramsey as a wealthy man among other wealthy men, suggesting the author was situating him in a class of people, not addressing him as a specific individual. Don't try to grow a brain, John. This line is personal. It uses his first name, implies knowledge of him, carries a contemptuous familiarity. The note oscillates between treating John Ramsey as a type, a wealthy businessman, a fat cat, and treating him as a specific known individual. This tension is either evidence of a staged note written by someone who knew him and was constructing a fictional kidnapper voice, or evidence of a real kidnapper who had researched his target and was affecting a voice. The 2.5 pages of handwriting represent the most direct evidence available of who was in that house on Christmas night, and they have never been definitively read. The physical search of the house by police in the days and weeks following the murder produced a number of additional items of interest. A length of nylon cord was found in a paper sack in the basement, of the same type as the cord used in the garrote. This suggested either that the person who made the garrote had brought more cord than needed, or that cord of this type had been present in the house before the murder. The source was never identified. A roll of duct tape was not found. The piece of tape found on JonBenét's mouth appeared to have come from a roll that was not located in the house. An intruder who brought a roll of duct tape and took the roll with them when they left would explain this. An inside actor who disposed of the roll after the fact would also explain it. The broken paintbrush from Patsy's art supply tray. The bristle end of the brush remained in the tray. The lower third, the piece incorporated into the garrote, was not found in the house despite extensive searching. Someone had taken it with them, or it was somewhere in the house that was not searched, or it had been disposed of. The piece that could most directly connect the garrote to its manufacture location was missing, the high-tech boot print on the wine cellar floor. This was a sole pattern consistent with the high-tech brand of outdoor and hiking boots, a brand popular in the 1990s. The print was photographed and documented. No family member was found to own high-tech boots. No police officer or crime scene technician who had been in the basement, to the extent that anyone could reconstruct who had been where, given the absence of a log, was identified as the source. The print was there, it belonged to someone, that someone has never been identified. The case against an intruder also has to account for the following sequence. An intruder would have needed to enter the house without being detected, navigate through the basement or through the main floor and then to the basement, locate and abduct JonBenét from her second-floor bedroom without waking anyone in the house, transport her to the basement, assault her and kill her over a period of time sufficient to write a nearly 400-word note, and then exit the house, all without leaving clear evidence of entry or exit, all without being heard by anyone except possibly a neighbor who reported a scream around midnight. The case against a family member has to account for the following. That person would have needed to have the skills and materials to construct a garrote, would have needed to write a 374-word ransom note using paper and pen from their own home, would have needed to place the body in the basement and latch the door from the inside, would have needed to place the note on the stairs, and would then have needed to call 911 and participate in the hours-long performance of a family waiting for a kidnapper's ransom call that they knew would never come. Both scenarios require things that are hard to accept. Both scenarios are consistent with some of the evidence and inconsistent with some of it. This is the case. This is why it has not been solved. At 1 p.m. on December 26, 1996, John Ramsey carried his daughter out of the wine cellar in Boulder, Colorado, and laid her on the living room floor near the Christmas tree. Detective Linda Arndt stood over JonBenét and understood that this was a murder, not a kidnapping, and that the crime scene had been compromised beyond recovery, and that the real investigation was only now beginning. It was 7 hours too late. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She had sung Christmas carols the night before. She had a bicycle with streamers on the handlebars. Whatever happened in that house, it happened to her. And whoever did it walked away into a December night in Boulder, Colorado, and has not been found. There is something that experienced homicide investigators say about murder scenes, which is that the scene tells a story if you're patient enough to listen to it. The scene at 755 15th Street in Boulder told a complicated story, one that two experienced, committed investigators spent decades trying to read, reaching opposite conclusions, and neither of them lived to see resolved. The story the scene told, if you were Lou Smith, an intruder entered through the broken basement window sometime before midnight on December 25. He had been to the house before, or had surveilled it and knew the window was broken. He knew about the basement layout. He may have entered on a previous occasion to familiarize himself with the space. He had a plan, the note, the cord, the duct tape. He may have brought the cord. He found JonBenét upstairs, used a stun gun to subdue her without waking anyone else, carried her to the basement. The assault was prolonged. He wrote the note on the kitchen pad, having possibly drafted it before, having its language ready. He placed the body in the wine cellar, latched the door to slow discovery, and exited the house. The boot print, the pubic hair, the unidentified DNA, these were the traces he left behind. The story the scene told, if you were Steve Thomas. JonBenét woke up in the night, came downstairs, ate pineapple from a bowl Burke had left out. Something happened between JonBenét and her mother, a confrontation, an accident, a moment of rage, a blow to the head, Patsy realizing what she had done. John Ramsey woken by some sound or by Patsy coming downstairs, the decision to cover it, the note written in the kitchen borrowing from films Patsy had seen. The staging, the cord, the paintbrush garrote, the duct tape, the blanket. The latched door. The long hours of holding a story together until morning, then the 911 call that was scripted to look like panic. Both stories are possible. Both contain elements that feel implausible when you examine them closely. The intruder theory requires a specific kind of criminal, organized, experienced, calm under pressure, knowledgeable about the house, who nevertheless left DNA behind and was never found despite one of the most exhaustive investigations in American crime history. The family theory requires parents who loved their daughter, who had fought cancer and buried their grief and built a life in Boulder, to have staged a scene, maintained a fiction, and lived inside that fiction for 30 years without anyone who knew them ever coming forward to say they had seen evidence of guilt. Neither story has been proven, neither story has been disproven. The evidence sits in a laboratory in Colorado, being retested with methods that did not exist in 1996. The database of DNA profiles grows larger every year. The technology of genetic genealogy has identified killers who had been undetected for decades. Somewhere in that evidence, the story the scene was telling is still there. It has not yet been fully heard. The ransom note ended with a line that is easy to overlook in the cataloging of its evidence. It is up to you now, John. It put the responsibility on him, whatever happened next, whether JonBenét lived or died, whether the money arrived or didn't, whether the family survived intact or was destroyed. The note placed the weight of that on John Ramsey's shoulders. This is also characteristic of the note's voice. It is intimate in its knowledge of John and contemptuous in its use of that knowledge. It is a voice that has studied its target and found the right place to apply pressure. John Ramsey has carried that weight for nearly 30 years. The weight of the note. The weight of the investigation. The weight of having opened a latched door in a basement and found his daughter. The weight of burying Patsy and continuing to push for answers when continuing might be the easier option by far. He has not stopped. He was in his 80s in 2025, and he sat across from the Boulder police chief and talked about genetic genealogy and what it would take to build a family tree from a degraded DNA sample, and whether the evidence that had been tested in 1996 still held enough genetic material to support that analysis. He has been asking the same question since December 26, 1996, when the officers arrived and the world turned. Who did this? The house at 755 15th Street in Boulder does not stand in the same form it did in December 1996. It has been renovated and sold more than once. The Christmas lights are long gone. The tree that stood in the living room where John laid his daughter down is gone. The basement where the wine cellar is still there, presumably because basements are structural, has been lived in and used by subsequent families who came after the Ramseys, who chose to live in a house with that history behind it, or who did not know or who knew and decided the house was just a house and the history was not theirs. But the case is not gone. The evidence is not gone. The DNA is in storage in Boulder, waiting for the technology to catch up to what it can tell us, or waiting for someone to run the right search against the right database, or waiting for a genealogist building a family tree somewhere to add the right entry that creates the right match. The night of December 25, 1996, waits in that evidence. The story of what happened in that house between 9:30 at night and 5:02 in the morning waits in that evidence. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She sang Christmas carols and fell asleep in the car on the way home. Her father carried her upstairs. Whatever came next, it was not something she chose and not something she could have prevented. It was done to her. And whoever did it has not yet been asked to explain themselves in a court of law. Not yet. There is one more detail about that night that has never been explained, and it is perhaps the strangest of all: the long underwear. When JonBenét was found in the wine cellar, she was wearing the white velvet pants and red turtleneck she had worn to the Christmas dinner. She was also wearing thermal long underwear beneath the pants. Long white long johns, a full bottom piece reaching from waist to ankle of the correct size for JonBenét and consistent with garments she owned. She was not wearing long underwear when John Ramsey put her to bed. She was not wearing long underwear at any point described during the Christmas dinner at the Whites'. No account from any witness at the Whites' party mentions JonBenét wearing anything that would have been visible beneath her outfit that suggested an additional underlayer. And the nature of the garment, thermal long underwear worn under fitted white velvet pants, would not have been comfortable or conventional as a party outfit. The long underwear was put on her at some point after she went to bed. Either she put it on herself, she woke up, got cold, went to her dresser and added an underlayer, which for a 6-year-old at midnight after a long Christmas day is not a typical behavior but is not impossible, or someone else dressed her in it. The DNA on the long underwear matched the male DNA from her underwear, an unidentified male. His touch DNA was on the waistband of a garment that had been put on JonBenét at some point in the hours before her death. If you accept the intruder theory, the long underwear was placed on JonBenét by the intruder, possibly as part of the staging, possibly for reasons that speak to the nature of the assault and the perpetrator's psychology. This interpretation fits the DNA evidence directly. If you do not accept the intruder theory, you have to explain how unidentified male DNA appeared on garments put on JonBenét in the middle of the night in a house where only her family was present. The question of the long underwear has never been satisfactorily answered by any theory. It is there. The DNA is there. The garment exists in the evidence record. Someone put it on her. The case is full of moments like this. Small, specific, physical facts that refuse to be absorbed into a clean narrative. The pineapple, the boot print, the garrote cord that didn't match anything in the house, the long underwear, the broken paintbrush third that was never found, the duct tape whose source was never identified. Each of these things is an artifact of the night of December 25, 1996. Each of them was left behind by whoever was in that basement. Each of them is evidence of something, and together they form an argument that has been made for 30 years by investigators and lawyers and journalists and documentary filmmakers, an argument that has not yet produced a name, a charge, a trial, but they are still there, in storage in Boulder, waiting. The investigation into the murder of JonBenét Ramsey is, as of this writing, the longest-running high-profile unsolved murder investigation in modern American history. It has generated more documentaries, more books, more television specials, more true crime podcast episodes, more online forum threads than any other unsolved American case. It has produced 2 DA administrations with opposing theories, a secret grand jury indictment, a formal public exoneration, multiple defamation suits, a false confession, and an unidentified male DNA profile that has been in a federal database for more than 20 years without producing a match. The case is not cold in the sense of being forgotten or set aside. Boulder police issue annual updates. The cold case review team digitized the evidence record. New testing is underway. John Ramsey is still attending meetings with police officials and still asking for answers, but it has not been solved. The The night of December 25, 1996, is preserved in evidence and testimony and the memory of the people who were there. It is as close to the surface of this case as anything else after all these years. You can reach it in any direction if you follow the case far enough. The Christmas dinner at the Whites, the carols, the dark car ride home, the bicycle against the wall, the lit Christmas tree in the living room, the stairs where Patsy found the note. The door in the basement with the wooden latch at the top of the frame. Behind that door, in the small dark room wrapped in white, a 6-year-old girl. Whatever happened to her happened there, in the dark, in the cold, on Christmas night, and the person who knows is still out there somewhere, or they are not, and the answer went with them. Either way, the question remains, what happened in that house? Consider what the hours felt like for the Ramsey family on the morning of December 26, if they were innocent. Patsy comes downstairs before 6 a.m., finds a ransom note on the stairs, runs to her daughter's empty room, calls the police in a state of terror. Police arrive, friends arrive. The hours pass. The ransom call does not come. The money is not arranged. The detective says the kidnapper will call between 8 and 10 a.m. It is now past noon. Her daughter has been missing for hours, and then her husband goes to the basement and opens a door and carries JonBenét upstairs, and whatever was still possible before that moment is no longer possible. If the Ramseys were innocent, those 7 hours between the 911 call and the discovery of the body were 7 hours of genuine mounting terror. Waiting for a phone to ring, watching the clock, being surrounded by people who were trying to comfort them in a situation where comfort was impossible, and then the moment, the worst moment, when the waiting ended. And then consider what those 7 hours felt like if they were not innocent. If the note on the stairs was their own note, and the body in the basement was there because of what they had done, the sustained performance of terror and anguish and desperate waiting maintained for 7 hours in a house full of people who were watching. That is a level of psychological control that would be, in clinical terms, remarkable. Both readings of those 7 hours are possible. Both have been argued. The investigation could not resolve which was true. 30 years could not resolve which was true. What can be said after all of it is this. JonBenét Ramsey was killed in her home on Christmas night in 1996. She died from a skull fracture and strangulation. An unidentified male's DNA was found on her clothing. No one has been charged. The case is open. The evidence is being retested. The rest is still the question. It is December 26, 1996. Boulder, Colorado. The mountains to the west. The snow on the ground. The Christmas lights along the roofline of the house at 755 15th Street. Inside, 7 hours after Patsy called 911, John Ramsey is carrying his daughter up from the basement. And everything that comes after, the investigation, the theories, the documentaries, the grand jury, the DNA testing, the false confession, the defamation suits, the Netflix documentary, the meeting with the police chief in January 2025, all of it flows from that moment. A latched door in a basement, a father's hand on the latch, what he found on the other side, and the person who put her there, who has never been named. The investigation into the murder of JonBenét Ramsey did not get off to a good start. That is a generous way to put it. By the time Detective Linda Arndt arrived at 8 a.m. on December 26, the house at 755 15th Street had already been open for 2 hours. Friends and family members had been moving through it. The kitchen had been cleaned, surfaces wiped, dishes moved, the ordinary tidying that people do when they are in a state of shock and need something to do with their hands. A crime scene that no one had yet officially designated a crime scene had been quietly, incrementally altered. By the time JonBenét's body was found at 1 p.m. and moved upstairs by her father, and the crime scene was formally recognized for what it was. The damage was extensive and irreversible. The former Boulder police chief Tom Kobe later acknowledged that the initial response was mishandled. Officers who arrived first did not take a log of who entered the house or which rooms they entered. The forensics team treated it as a kidnapping, not a homicide, and cordoned off only JonBenét's bedroom. The rest of the house, the kitchen with its fingerprints and pineapple bowl, the basement with its boot prints and latched door, the art supply room with the broken paintbrush tray, was left accessible to anyone who walked through. When JonBenét's body was found and moved, no one had yet secured the wine cellar as an intact crime scene. By the time investigators were taking it seriously, as the scene of a murder, it was no longer intact. The errors compounded. Evidence was shared with the Ramseys in the early investigation, a significant breach of standard protocol that meant potential suspects had access to what investigators knew and were building toward. The informal conversations with John and Patsy in the first days after the murder were cursory and poorly documented. No formal interrogations happened until April 30th, 1997, 4 months later. In the interim, the Ramseys had retained excellent legal counsel, were communicating primarily through attorneys, and were declining to give the kind of extended, unguarded access to investigators that might have produced useful information in the early weeks. This was entirely their right, but it fueled an already inflamed public narrative about the family. The Ramseys were wealthy and had lawyers, and were not cooperating fully. And in the court of public opinion that read as guilt, Boulder was a university town. It had a police department accustomed to handling campus incidents, occasional property crime, the relatively low homicide reality of an affluent Colorado city. It was not equipped by experience or infrastructure for a high-profile child murder case that would attract national media within hours. Within days of JonBenét's death, the satellite trucks were outside. The tabloids were running their own parallel investigations, often with better resources than the police department. Cable television programs were interviewing anyone who had ever spoken to the Ramseys. The National Enquirer ran photographs. The Globe ran theories. Every 2 weeks there was a new alleged suspect, a new unnamed source, a new detail that may or may not have come from inside the investigation. The noise was enormous, and the noise made the investigation harder. The Boulder Police Department focused almost immediately on John and Patsy Ramsey. This was not irrational in isolation. Statistically, when a child is killed inside their home, the perpetrator is overwhelmingly likely to be a household member or someone very close to the family. Former FBI profiler Greg McCrary noted publicly that it was a 12-to-1 probability that it's a family member or a caregiver in child homicide cases. The evidence in the house, the ransom note written on house materials, the body found inside rather than taken, the apparent staging of a kidnapping that never actually occurred, the paintbrush from Patsy's art supplies, all of it pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of the space. But focusing almost exclusively on the Ramseys, as Boulder police did throughout 1997, meant that other avenues received less attention than they deserved. By October 1997, the department had more than 1,600 people in their index of persons of interest. The vast majority of those 1,600 were not being pursued with the resources allocated to the investigation of John and Patsy. There were other leads. There had been more than 100 burglaries in the University Hill neighborhood in the months preceding December 25, 1996. Several of those burglaries had occurred at homes similar to the Ramseys' large, multi-story, with basements and multiple entry points. The neighborhood had a pattern of intrusion that the investigation largely set aside in its focus on the family. There were 38 registered sex offenders living within 2 miles of the Ramsey home at the time of the murder. Several were identified and investigated as persons of interest. None was charged. Some were eliminated through DNA comparison. Others remained in the record without definitive resolution. The high-tech boot print on the wine cellar floor was never matched. Investigators confirmed that no member of the Ramsey family owned high-tech boots. They also needed to account for every officer and investigator who had entered the basement on December 26. There was no log of who had gone where. Officers who had been in the basement were later asked about their footwear and were not able to provide complete enough information to definitively identify the source of the print. The print remained in the evidence record unmatched. A pubic hair found in the white blanket wrapped around JonBenét did not match any Ramsey family member. It was submitted for DNA analysis. It was never matched to anyone else either. In early 1997, the Boulder County District Attorney's Office recruited Lou Smith. Smith was 60 years old, recently retired, and possessed of a career record in homicide investigation that was, by any objective measure, remarkable. In 30-plus years working homicide cases in Colorado Springs and the surrounding region, he had solved every case he investigated. Every one. He had done this in environments with fewer resources, less sophisticated technology, and less public attention than the Ramsey case would generate, and he had still produced results. His reputation in Colorado law enforcement was substantial. He came to Boulder, reviewed the evidence from scratch, and reached a conclusion that directly contradicted what the police had been building toward for more than a year. Lou Smith believed the evidence pointed to an intruder. He believed John and Patsy Ramsey had not killed their daughter. This conclusion was based on specific evidence he examined carefully and in detail. The basement window. On the south side of the Ramsey basement, there was a window that led into a window well on the outside of the house. The window was broken. John Ramsey had broken it himself months earlier when he locked himself out of the house, and it had not been repaired. On the night of December 25, the window was still broken. The metal grate covering the window well was not locked. Smith argued that an intruder could have entered through this window, climbing down into the window well, pushing through the broken pane, and entering the basement. Critics identified serious problems with this theory. There was an intact cobweb in the window track. The steel grate covering the window well had undisturbed cobwebs. The foliage around the grate, according to investigators who examined it, did not appear to have been recently disturbed. Outside, despite fresh snow on the ground that would have preserved tracks, no footprints were found leading to or from the window. Well, Smith had responses to these criticisms. The snow, he argued, had been disturbed in ways consistent with tracks and then refrozen, obscuring the original impressions. The cobwebs could have been disturbed and then reattached by the web's own adhesive properties. He demonstrated this, or tried to, with his own experiments. Neither position was definitively proven. Inside the basement, near the broken window, investigators found a suitcase. It belonged to John Andrew Ramsey, one of John Ramsey's adult sons from his first marriage, who had visited for the holidays. The suitcase was positioned beneath the window in a way that suggested it might have been used as a step to reach and climb through the window frame. John Ramsey had not placed it there. No family member claimed to have placed it there. How it came to be in that position, whether it was left there by John Andrew when he packed to leave after his holiday visit, whether it was moved by someone preparing to enter, or whether it had been moved during the chaotic morning of December 26 by someone who was not paying close attention, is unknown. The marks on JonBenét's skin. Examining the autopsy photographs with care, Smith identified two sets of marks, one on her lower left back, one on her left cheek, that he believed were consistent with stun gun prong marks. He conducted his own experiments, purchasing a commercially available stun gun and testing it on anesthetized pigs, photographing the results and comparing them to the autopsy images. The marks he produced, he argued, were nearly identical in spacing and appearance to the marks on JonBenét. This evidence is disputed. Other forensic experts who reviewed the same autopsy photographs reached different conclusions. They identified the marks as abrasions, as contact marks consistent with the child having been dragged or having slept against a surface, not as the characteristic paired burn marks left by a stun gun's electrodes. No stun gun was ever found in connection with the case. The stun gun theory has never been definitively proven or disproven. The garrote itself. Lou Smith argued that the construction of the garrote, a specific technique using a stick or rod to wind and tighten a cord around a victim's neck, was evidence of premeditation and knowledge that went beyond apparent improvising in a panic. This was not a scarf pulled tight or a cord simply looped and yanked. This was a constructed device with a specific mechanical advantage built into it, the kind of thing that requires intention and some knowledge of what you're doing. Critics argued the opposite, that the use of a paintbrush handle from Patsy's own supplies meant the garrote was improvised from materials available in the house, which pointed towards someone already inside the house, not someone who brought their own equipment. In May 1998, Smith presented his findings to Boulder police investigators. The presentation was detailed. The evidence was specific. He had photographs, comparisons, timelines. He concluded that the evidence, taken in its totality, pointed away from the Ramseys and toward an unidentified intruder. The Boulder Police Department was not persuaded. The conflict between Smith and the Boulder investigators became one of the defining tensions of the investigation in 1997 and 1998, two camps with opposite conclusions, working the same evidence, increasingly unable to reconcile their positions. The district attorney's office, which was overseeing Smith's work, found itself in deepening tension with the police department. Colorado Governor Roy Romer intervened and appointed Michael Caine as a special prosecutor to take the case to a grand jury. Smith resigned on September 20th, 1998, 5 days after the grand jury was convened. He could not support a proceeding he believed was pursuing the wrong people. He left the investigation, but not the case. He would continue working it privately until his death in 2010. Detective Steve Thomas resigned shortly after. His resignation letter to the police chief accused the district attorney's office of interfering with and failing to support the investigation. Thomas believed Patsy Ramsey had killed JonBenét. He believed the DA had protected the Ramseys. He was furious. He left the department and wrote a book, JonBenét, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, that laid out his theory and his criticisms of how the case had been handled. The Ramseys' legal team sued. The suit was settled out of court. Thomas and Smith, the two most experienced and committed investigators on the case, and they had opposite conclusions. Both resigned rather than compromise what they believed the evidence. The year 1998 was, in many respects, the investigation's crisis point. Both of the detectives most committed to the case had now left. Lou Smith, who had believed in the intruder theory with a conviction that exceeded the institutional comfort of the DA's office, resigned in September. Steve Thomas, who had believed with equal conviction that Patsy was responsible, and who had grown furious at what he saw as the DA's protective posture toward the Ramseys, left shortly after. The grand jury was convened under Special Prosecutor Michael Caine, but Caine was operating under a secrecy requirement that meant the public knew almost nothing about what was being considered. Meanwhile, the Ramseys were doing something that investigators found frustrating and that the public found suspicious. They were cooperating, but on their own terms. They gave interviews, carefully managed ones, to sympathetic journalists, with legal counsel present or nearby. They appeared on national television. They maintained their innocence with a consistency and composure that some found credible and others found damning. Innocent people, the argument went, behave differently. They are more cooperative, more desperate, more willing to give investigators whatever they need. The Ramseys behaved like people with lawyers. The Ramseys would have argued, and did argue, that the reason they behaved like people with lawyers was that the Boulder Police Department had treated them as suspects from the first morning, had shared evidence improperly, had built a theory around them without sufficient basis, and had made it clear that cooperating on Boulder PD's terms meant being processed as the likely guilty parties in their own daughter's murder. Under those circumstances, retaining excellent legal counsel and communicating through attorneys was not evasion. It was self-preservation. Both things can be simultaneously true. The Ramseys' caution made the investigation harder, and the investigation gave the Ramseys reason to be cautious. The other major thread in the investigation during this period was the pursuit of alternative suspects, the people Lou Smith had identified or the department had been tracking alongside its focus on the family. One of the most significant was Gary Howard Oliva. Oliva was a registered sex offender with a documented history of offenses against children. He had been in the Boulder area. He was one of the individuals Lou Smith identified as a person of interest, and he was featured publicly as a suspect in a 2002 broadcast of 48 Hours Investigates. Oliva was tested against the DNA profile from JonBenét's clothing. The public result of that test was never definitively disclosed, meaning Oliva was not publicly cleared the way some other persons of interest were cleared, but he was also not charged with anything related to JonBenét's death. In 2016, he was arrested on charges of sexual exploitation of a child and convicted in 2019, sentenced to 20 years in prison. His relationship to the JonBenét case remains officially unresolved in the public record. There were others. Bill McReynolds, a former University of Colorado professor who had played Santa Claus for the Ramseys in the years before the murder, was identified as a person of interest and investigated. His wife had written a play involving a child who was kept in a basement, a detail that struck some investigators as significant and others as coincidental. McReynolds was cleared through DNA. Chris Wolf, a local journalist and an early person of interest, was named in a book by the Ramseys as someone they believed should have been more thoroughly investigated. He sued for defamation. The federal judge overseeing that case concluded there was virtually no evidence supporting the theory that the Ramseys had killed JonBenét, and the suit was dismissed. Michael Helgoth, another name from the investigation, died in what appeared to be a suicide shortly after JonBenét's murder. Investigators looked at him. He owned a high-tech boot consistent with the print found in the wine cellar. but there was no DNA evidence connecting him to JonBenét, and his death made further investigation impossible in the usual ways. Hundreds of DNA tests were conducted over the years against the male profile recovered from the clothing. Hundreds of people were eliminated. The profile remained unmatched in CODIS as of the last public reporting. The investigation produced a vast paper record, more than 30,000 pages of reports, tips, interviews, lab results. In 2023, the Colorado Cold Case Review team spent a year digitizing and organizing this record, creating a searchable database that gave investigators tools for the first time to look across the full scope of what had been gathered. Whether that reorganization produces new connections, whether a tip from 1997 cross-referenced against a DNA test from 2012 produces something neither alone would show, is one of the things that current investigators are working toward. Technology has changed what is possible. In 2018, the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, was identified after more than 40 years of evading identification through the technique of genetic genealogy. Investigators uploaded a DNA profile from his crime scenes to a public genealogy database and built a family tree outward from partial matches, eventually narrowing to DeAngelo as the individual who fit all the criteria. He was arrested, he was convicted, he was sentenced to life in prison. The same technique has since been applied to dozens of cold cases. Some have produced identifications and convictions. Others have produced identifications, but not convictions. The identified person died, or the evidence was insufficient for prosecution. A few have produced dead ends. The question for the JonBenét Ramsey case is whether the DNA profile that has been in evidence for more than 20 years is usable for this purpose. Touch DNA degrades. Samples that have been handled, tested, and stored over decades lose genetic material over time. The original samples from JonBenét's clothing were not ideal to begin with. They were small, mixed with her own DNA, and had been processed multiple times by different laboratories using the evolving methods of different eras. Whether enough remains to support a genetic genealogy analysis is something the Colorado Bureau of Investigation is currently trying to determine. If it does, if the sample can be uploaded and a family tree can be built, then the answer that has been out of reach since 1996 might be closer than it has ever been. If it cannot, if the DNA is too degraded, the profile too incomplete, then the investigation is left with the other evidence, which is substantial, but which has not, in 30 years, been sufficient to produce a name. The investigation is still going. It has always been still going. There is a specific detail about the investigation that deserves attention before moving on, because it captures something essential about why the case went the way it did. In any homicide investigation, the first 48 hours are the most important. Memories are freshest. Physical evidence is least disturbed. The people closest to the crime are still close to it in time, before the defensive structures of lawyers and strategy and narrative management have had a chance to form around them. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, those 48 hours were spent treating the wrong event. The house was treated as a kidnapping scene. The basement door was not opened. The kitchen was cleaned. The crime scene was not a crime scene officially until the middle of the afternoon of December 26, by which point the most critical evidence had already been disturbed, moved, or contaminated. This is not ultimately a story about bad investigators or bad people. The officers who responded were not prepared for what they found. The detective who arrived at 8 a.m. was alone in a house with too many people and not enough support. The decisions made in those hours were made by people who did not yet know they were working a murder. But those decisions changed the case permanently, and whoever killed JonBenét Ramsey has lived with the benefit of those decisions for nearly 30 years. The grand jury's indictment was never made public in 1999. Alex Hunter declined to sign it on October 13, 1999, and the world was told that the grand jury investigation had been inconclusive, that 13 months of proceedings and the testimony of dozens of witnesses had not produced enough clarity to bring charges. This was not technically a lie. It was a significant omission. The grand jury had reached a conclusion. The DA had reached a different conclusion. Both were held in confidence. The sealed documents remained in a Boulder courthouse. For 14 years, the public believed the grand jury had found nothing. In the meantime, the Ramseys rebuilt as much of a life as was available to them. They had left Boulder in 1997 and relocated to Atlanta. They had given interviews, hired lawyers, fought a sustained public relations campaign against a sustained public presumption of guilt. In 2000, they published a book, The Death of Innocence, in which they named several individuals they believed law enforcement should have investigated more seriously as suspects. Two of those individuals sued for defamation. The Ramseys' legal team, led by Atlanta attorney L. Lynn Wood, obtained dismissal of both suits. One federal judge reviewing evidence in a related 2003 civil case wrote that there was virtually no evidence supporting the theory that the Ramseys had killed their daughter, but abundant evidence supporting the belief that an intruder had entered the home. Patsy died on June 24, 2006. This needs more than a sentence. She had spent the decade from JonBenét's death to her own facing a double burden. The grief of losing a 6-year-old daughter in the most violent and public way imaginable, and the sustained accusation, never officially resolved in the way that a conviction or an acquittal would resolve it, that she had something to do with it. She could not walk through an airport without someone recognizing her. She could not give an interview without being asked about the ransom note. She had cancer again, and she was fighting it again, and she was doing all of this while the Boulder Police Department still had her name in their case files as a subject of interest. The cancer had returned in 2003. She had been in remission for 9 years after the 1993 battle. It came back quietly and then with more force than the first time. She underwent treatment again. It did not respond the way it had in the early 1990s. She died at her father's home in Roswell, Georgia, with John beside her. She was 49 years old. She was buried next to JonBenét in St. James Episcopal Cemetery in Marietta, Georgia. Mother and daughter in the same ground. The grave that should have had decades of flowers between them had none. 3 days after Patsy was buried, barely 3 days, John Mark Kerr was arrested in Bangkok. Carr was a 41-year-old American schoolteacher who had been living in Thailand and before that had drifted through a series of teaching positions in countries with limited oversight of foreign educators. He had been in contact for several years with a University of Colorado journalism professor named Michael Tracy, who had produced a series of documentaries about the JonBenét case and who had developed an email correspondence with Carr after encountering him through case-related online discussions. Over the course of those emails, Carr's communications had become increasingly alarming, sexual fixation on JonBenét expressed in language that was both disturbing and specific. Eventually, the communications included what appeared to be claims of direct involvement in her death. Tracy brought this to the attention of investigators. Thai authorities, coordinating with American law enforcement, arrested Carr in Bangkok in August 2006 and extradited him to the United States. The media response was extraordinary, even by the standards of a case that had generated extraordinary media responses for a decade. The story was everywhere. Every cable news channel covered the extradition in real time. There were photographs of Carr being escorted onto a plane in Bangkok wearing a collared shirt and appearing calm, almost pleased. There was footage of him on the flight drinking champagne and eating what was reported as foie gras, which detail produced a specific quality of public contempt, the spectacle of someone confessing to the murder of a 6-year-old girl and marking the occasion with a nice meal. Carr's confession was detailed in certain respects and hollow in others. He said he had been with JonBenét when she died. He said the death was an accident. He said he had drugged her before the assault, that she had not suffered. He expressed love for her, which was perhaps the most disturbing element of what he said. The problems with the confession materialized within hours. The autopsy had found no drugs in JonBenét's system, no sedatives, no sleeping medication, nothing consistent with having been drugged. Carr's claim that he had given her something was directly contradicted by physical evidence. The confession contained no information that was not already in the public record. A genuine confession in a homicide case typically includes specific, verifiable details that only the perpetrator would know. The location of physical evidence, the sequence of events, details about the victim that have not been reported. Carr's version of events contained nothing that went beyond what anyone who had read about the case for years could have assembled. His alibi was substantial. His ex-wife and members of his family placed him in Alabama during Christmas 1996. Alabama is not Colorado. There was no evidence, and there has never been any evidence that Carr was in Boulder on December 25, 1996. Most conclusively, his DNA was tested against the male DNA profile from JonBenét's clothing. It did not match. John Mark Carr was released. No charges were filed. The case against him collapsed completely within days of his arrival in the United States. the car episode was not a neutral event in the case's history. It consumed enormous investigative resources, diverted attention from other possible leads, generated a media frenzy that reopened every wound the case had created, and left behind the distinct residue of a broken promise, the sense that an answer had been within reach and then turned out to be hollow. It also raised uncomfortable questions about how a disturbed man with no connection to the crime had been allowed to consume months of investigation based entirely on emails that should, in retrospect, have been more carefully evaluated. For John Ramsey, the car episode had another dimension. Patsy had just died. She had died without knowing who killed JonBenét. She had died under a cloud she had spent 10 years trying to clear. When Carr was arrested, John had reason to hope, briefly, that an answer was coming, that Patsy might somehow be vindicated retroactively, that the mystery would resolve. Then it fell apart. In 2008, the case made a formal turn. Mary Lacey's office commissioned touched DNA testing of JonBenét's long underwear, the thermal long johns found on her body that she had not been wearing when she went to bed. Touch DNA, which recovers genetic material from skin cells deposited by handling, had advanced significantly as a forensic technique since the technology was introduced in the late 1990s. Applied to the waistband area of the long underwear, the testing produced a genetic profile. It matched the unidentified male DNA from the underwear tested in 2003. Same unknown male, 2 separate garments, 2 different sample types. Same genetic signature appearing in the evidence from the same crime. And the entire Ramsey family was excluded as contributors. On July 9, 2008, DA Mary Lacey wrote a letter to John Ramsey formally exonerating the family. The letter was addressed to him personally and was released publicly. It stated plainly that the DNA evidence cleared John Ramsey, his late wife Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey of any involvement in JonBenét's death. This was not a small thing. It was the formal, public, legal clearing of a family that had spent 11 years under suspicion without charges, without trial, without the chance to defend themselves in a court of law. Patsy was gone and could not receive the letter, but her name was in it. Her name was cleared. The response was mixed. Former Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner, by then retired, disagreed publicly with the exoneration. In 2015, he said the clearing of the Ramseys based on touch DNA evidence was premature. He argued that trace DNA from skin cells can be deposited on clothing through any number of innocent routes during manufacturing, packaging, handling by store employees, contact with other people in a retail environment. He believed the DNA was significant, but not necessarily proof that its source was the killer. Beckner also stated that the unknown DNA has got to be the focus of the investigation, not as a reason to exonerate the Ramseys, but as a reason to pursue identification of the donor. He was not arguing that the Ramseys were guilty. He was arguing that a piece of evidence had been used to foreclose an inn. The years after the exoneration produced a peculiar stasis. The case was officially open. The Ramseys were officially cleared. The unidentified DNA was officially the focus of the investigation. But without a match in CODIS, without new physical evidence, without a witness coming forward after all the years, the investigation moved slowly, methodically, but slowly. In 2013, the release of the sealed grand jury documents generated a new wave of media attention. People who had followed the case for years learned that the grand jury had voted to indict in 1999 and that the DA had stopped it. This produced predictable division. Some argued Hunter had been right to stop an unwinnable prosecution. Others argued he had protected people who should have been tried. The arguments mapped roughly onto the existing fault lines in the case. People who believed the Ramseys were responsible found the unreleased indictment vindicating. People who believed in the intruder theory found it irrelevant, since the charges had been for child endangerment, not murder. The question of what the grand jury actually believed was never publicly answered. Grand jurors are sworn to secrecy. None of them, as far as the public record shows, has spoken on the record about what they heard and how they weighed it. In November 2024, Netflix released Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, a 3-part documentary directed by Joe Berlinger. Berlinger had access to previously unseen material, including audio diaries recorded by Lou Smith during his active investigation, journals of a man working a case he could not set down, tracking his thoughts and observations in real time, preserving a record of how his conclusion developed and what he saw in the evidence. The documentary was explicit in its position. The evidence pointed to an intruder. It argued that the Boulder Police Department's early focus on the Ramseys had been an investigative error that had cost the case critical early momentum. It featured John Ramsey, who spoke at length and who made clear that 30 years had not diminished his determination to find an answer. The documentary reached a substantial audience. The case retains its hold on the public in a way that few 30-year-old murders do, because it was never resolved and because the questions it raises are genuinely unresolved. It is not a case where most people believe they know what happened and are waiting for a conviction. It is a case where the people who have looked most closely at the evidence have sometimes reached opposite conclusions, and where the physical record has never been fully decoded. John Ramsey appeared at CrimeCon 2025 in Denver in early September 2025 and shared updates on the investigation. He spoke about the DNA testing underway. He spoke about genetic genealogy. He spoke in the measured, controlled way of a man who has been talking about this case for 30 years and has learned to calibrate his hope carefully, to not let himself believe too much in any particular development, because the history of the case includes too many developments that turned out to be dead ends. He is still asking the question. He has been asking it since December 26, 1996. The answer is somewhere in the evidence. The evidence is in a laboratory in Boulder. The technology is being applied. Whether it is enough, whether the answer will come in John Ramsey's lifetime, whether he will know before he dies who killed his daughter, is something that cannot be answered now. What can be said is that the physical evidence from the night of December 25, 1996, still exists. It has not been lost. It is being worked. The question it encodes has not expired. The case is open. John Ramsey left Boulder 6 months after JonBenét's death. He and Patsy and Burke spent the summer of 1997 at the Charlevoix vacation home in Michigan, the place they had been headed on the morning of December 26th, and then relocated permanently to Atlanta. Boulder had become unlivable. The house on 15th Street had been their home for 5 years, but it was also a crime scene, a media destination, a place that strangers drove past to take photographs. They left it behind. The house was eventually sold. Burke grew up in Atlanta. He was 9 when his sister died. He was 12 when the grand jury met and refused to indict anyone. He was 15 when he knew, though the rest of the world did not yet, that the grand jury had actually voted to indict his parents and a DA had stopped it. He was a teenager through the full flowering of cable news coverage, through the true crime books, through the TV specials and the documentaries. He finished high school. He went to college at Purdue University. He got a degree in computer systems and earned a graduate certificate in software engineering. He built a quiet life that the cameras did not find. In 2016, when the CBS documentary implied he had killed his sister as a 9-year-old, he gave a single interview to Dr. Phil, a calculated choice of venue, a controlled setting with a predictable audience, and he said what he needed to say, that his family did not hurt JonBenét, that the accusations were false, that he was not going to spend his life in public trying to defend himself against things that were not true, and then he filed the lawsuit. The lawsuit against CBS was settled in January 2019. Burke's attorney said it was resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. No verdict was entered. No finding of fact. No public accounting of what CBS had gotten right or wrong. Just a settlement, which is what most defamation cases produce when they involve a plaintiff who can demonstrate harm and a defendant who prefers resolution to a trial. Burke Ramsey does not do press. He does not appear in documentaries. He has not written a book or given interviews about what it was like to grow up in the shadow of his sister's murder. He has, by every available indication, chosen the only form of privacy available to him, the deliberate kind, maintained by silence. John Ramsey moved to Moab, Utah. He married for the 3rd time in 2011, a Las Vegas-based fashion designer named Jan Rousseau. He has continued, quietly but persistently, to advocate for the resolution of his daughter's case. He has met with Boulder police officials. He has spoken publicly about the need for genetic genealogy testing to be applied to the unidentified male DNA. He appeared in the Netflix documentary in November 2024, Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, directed by Joe Berlinger, and gave what was described as uncompensated testimony with no editorial input over the content. He is in his 80s now. He has been waiting for an answer for nearly 30 years. Lou Smit worked the JonBenét Ramsey case until he died. He retired from official involvement in September 1998, when he resigned, but he never retired from the case itself. He kept files, kept in contact with investigators, kept pursuing the intruder theory that he had staked his professional conclusion on. He shared his findings freely with researchers and journalists who were working the case seriously. He died on August 11, 2010. He was 73 years old. He had spent 12 years working the case after resigning from the investigation. He died without an answer, which was the outcome he had spent those years trying to prevent. In 2024, the Netflix documentary brought the case to a new generation of viewers who were not alive in 1996. Joe Berlinger, the director, had access to previously unseen material, including audio diaries recorded by Lou Smith during his investigation. The series argued firmly that the evidence pointed to an intruder and that the Ramseys had been wrongly targeted by the initial investigation. John Ramsey participated. The series reached a substantial audience. In December 2023, the Colorado Cold Case Review Team completed a year-long analysis of the Ramsey case. They digitized all evidence into a searchable database, nearly 2,500 pieces of evidence, every tip, every interview, every photograph. The goal was to make the accumulated record accessible in ways it had not been before, to allow investigators to look across the full body of evidence with modern tools. As of early 2025, dozens of items were being retested at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Some were evidence that had been tested in 1996 and 1997, but not with the sensitivity of current methods. Some were items that had never been tested at all. The focus, John Ramsey said after meeting with the police chief, was on genetic genealogy, the technique that had solved the Golden State Killer case in 2018 by building a family tree from a crime scene DNA sample and working backward through ancestry databases until the perpetrator was identified. That approach requires a usable DNA sample. The unidentified male DNA from JonBenét's clothing is degraded. It has been handled, stored, and tested multiple times over 30 years. Whether enough remains to support genetic genealogy analysis is one of the central questions the current testing is trying to answer. Boulder also had a scandal. In 2025, a crime lab analyst who may have worked on the JonBenét Ramsey case pleaded guilty to mishandling DNA evidence in other cases. The implications for the Ramsey case evidence, if any, have not been publicly established. The case changed Boulder in ways that are difficult to measure precisely. The University Hill neighborhood absorbed the notoriety as best it could. The house on 15th Street changed owners and eventually changed enough that it no longer looked like the house on television. But the case became part of the city's identity in the way that unwanted things sometimes do. You cannot mention Boulder in a true crime context without it surfacing, cannot write about the case without the city becoming part of the argument. The media coverage in the late 1990s introduced tabloid-scale scrutiny to a city that had not been accustomed to it, and some of what it introduced did not leave. The habit of treating a family's grief as public spectacle, the confidence with which commentators who had never been to Boulder and had no access to the evidence declared the Ramseys guilty, the way the pageant footage was played on TV news as if it were evidence of something, as if a child winning a beauty competition made her death more explicable or her mother more suspicious. JonBenét Ramsey would have been 35 years old in 2026. That is worth sitting with for a moment. She would have had a life. She might have remained in Colorado or moved somewhere else entirely. She might have continued performing or discovered that the thing she loved at 6 was not the thing she loved at 20. She would have had opinions and friendships and ordinary days and difficult ones. She would have grown into someone. The crime stole that from her and replaced it with an image, a child in a pageant costume, frozen, photographed, replayed. She was a 6-year-old girl who liked to sing and had just gotten a bicycle. The rest is what happened to her. It has not been answered. The tabloid coverage of the Ramsey family in the late 1990s was some of the most sustained and vicious media treatment any private American family had received in the TV age. The National Enquirer ran the Ramseys on its cover repeatedly. Other supermarket tabloids followed. Cable TV shows reconstructed the crime with actors and narrated it with certainty about conclusions that the investigation itself had not reached. The coverage created a public verdict without a trial, a conviction in the court of opinion that could not be appealed and from which the Ramseys could not find relief. This coverage had effects that went beyond the Ramsey family's personal experience of it. It affected the investigation. investigators who leaked information to the press, as some did, in what Boulder officials later admitted was an intentional strategy to pressure the Ramseys into cooperating, found that the leaks produced stories that made the case harder to try, not easier. Potential witnesses had been exposed to so much media narrative that their recollections were contaminated by it. The distinction between what people had actually observed and what they had seen on television became, over time, harder to maintain. It affected the public's understanding of the case in ways that persist to this day. People who formed opinions about the Ramseys in 1997 based on tabloid coverage often maintained those opinions regardless of what subsequent investigation revealed. The 2008 exoneration did not reach everyone who had formed a view in 1997. The 2013 revelation about the grand jury did not change many minds, since it was interpreted through the lens of whatever prior belief the reader held. This is one of the ways the JonBenét Ramsey case matters beyond the specific crime. It is a case study in what happens when a murder investigation and a media spectacle become the same event. The two things fed each other in 1997 in ways that were damaging to both. The investigation was made harder by the coverage. The coverage was made sensational by details that should have remained within the investigation. The result was a years-long feedback loop that did not produce clarity. It produced noise. John Ramsey understood this eventually, if he did not understand it from the beginning. His public statements in recent years show a man who has made his peace with the noise, who has moved past trying to counter every theory or respond to every documentary, and who focuses instead on the specific, actionable thing: the DNA, the database, the genealogy search, the meeting with the chief. He wants an answer. He has always wanted an answer. The noise was always in the way of the answer. Now it is quieter. The tabloids that once ran his name on their covers have folded or faded. The cable shows that reconstructed the crime have moved on to other reconstructions. What remains is a serious ongoing forensic investigation, a searchable database of 2,500 pieces of evidence, and a male DNA profile in storage in Colorado that has been there for more than 2 decades. Somewhere in all of that, if the technology is sufficient and the sample holds and the right search is run at the right moment, is the answer. It has not come yet, but it has not been given up on either. That is where this case stands. Nearly 30 years after the night it began, still open, still being worked, still carrying the weight of a 6-year-old girl who deserved better than the question she has become. On the night of December 25, 1996, in Boulder, Colorado, the snow was on the ground and the Christmas lights were still on, and a 6-year-old girl went to sleep in her bedroom after a long holiday and never woke up. That is the fact at the center of everything. All the rest of it, the note, the evidence, the investigations, the investigators who resigned, the grand jury that met in secret, the district attorney who refused to sign, all of that is the aftermath of that fact. The fact itself is simple, and the fact itself is the part that stays. Somewhere there is a person who knows what happened in that house. Maybe that person is still living. Maybe they have watched the documentaries. Maybe they have read the books. Maybe they have sat in silence while everyone around them argued about evidence and DNA and handwriting analysis and remained very still, the way people remain still when movement would draw attention to where they are. Or maybe not. Maybe there is no living person who knows, because the person who did this has died too, carrying it with them, and the answer went with them into the ground. That is not impossible. It is nearly 30 years. What is not in doubt is that there is a physical answer. The DNA on JonBenét's clothing belongs to someone. The boot print in the wine cellar was left by a boot. The note was written by a hand. These things exist in the physical world. They have an explanation. The explanation is a person. That person has not been identified. But the technology being applied to the evidence now is different from what existed in 1996. Genetic genealogy has done in other cases what decades of conventional investigation could not. The Colorado Cold Case Review Team has digitized the full record. New interviews are being conducted. New testing is underway. John Ramsey, at 83 years old, went to Boulder and sat across a table from the police chief and talked about what it would take to get to an answer. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. A man who buried his daughter in 1996 and has carried the absence of an answer for 29 years, going back one more time, sitting at one more table, going through it one more time. Some things do not resolve. Some cases do not close. The evidence sits in storage and the years accumulate, and the people who were there grow old, and the question stays exactly where it was. And sometimes, not always, not even usually, but sometimes, something shifts. A database entry changes, a genealogy match surfaces in a family tree that someone built for other reasons. A sample that was too degraded in 1996 yields something with 2026 technology. A person who knows something decides after 29 years that carrying it is no longer worth the wait. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey is the kind of case that makes you want resolution on behalf of someone who cannot ask for it herself. She was 6 years old. She got a bicycle for Christmas. Sleep well.